there was this really incredible moment with one of the patients who just overwhelmed me with his capacity for forgiveness. And he wasn't the only one. Actually, he wasn't the only patient. And the fact that you could go through all of this and then forgive, I mean, that's just, I really wanted that moment to end quietly and to end on this act of forgiveness is, to me, a really powerful thing. And one of my favorite writers, Anne Lamott, her phrase, grace always bats last. So I thought grace bats last. And that's how the podcast ends is, grace bats last.
Hello, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Eric Chakowski. I'm one of the worship directors here at First United Methodist Church Richardson. And with me this week, we have two of our associate pastors, Josh Fitzpatrick, and for the very last time on More Than Sunday, no, I shouldn't say that.
You'll have me back.
For the end of this time period, Julie Henson as she moves on to her next chapter in Nashville.
Yeah, that's right. Kyle and I are getting ready to move to Nashville. And so one of the things that I won't continue to do is obviously host this podcast. But, Eric and I, we started this at the beginning of 2018 where we thought, we need a bridge between Sundays. So the More Than Sunday podcast, and we really wanted to have wonderful conversations with really interesting people about their faith, about their experiences, about their questions, and their stories. And so getting to not only start this podcast, but to get to be a part of it, and I know Eric and I have talked about it a lot, it's just been holy moments in the headphones. And so it is something that I am so grateful to have just been a part of, and to be part of a church like First Methodist Richardson that has not only been able to support something like this, but really take a risk that something like this might actually work and make a difference. And who would have thought when we started this, over a year ago, that we would be interviewing someone like Laura Beil today, who hosts her own podcast that reaches 30 million people. It's just really cool. I'm really glad I've gotten to be a part of it.
So exciting. Well, it's been such a treat hosting with you for 50-ish episodes.
Yeah.
And I meant what I said earlier. This certainly won't be the last time that we have you on. We'll definitely be checking in with you from time to time. And,
I won't be
love
a stranger.
to have you back.
Well, and I'll tell you from the outside looking in, the podcast is one of my first impressions of First United Methodist Church Richardson. And to hear you two give all these interviews on a weekly basis, and Julie, just to hear your heart in their interviews was something that immediately drew me to this church. We're definitely going to miss your voice here.
Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to miss y'all too.
Well, it's been a joy having you. We've got a great conversation ahead of us today. I'm really excited to continue having these kinds of conversations with Josh for many episodes to come. But again, Julie, it's been a joy to have you. And let's have a great conversation with Laura Beil.
Today we're joined by Laura Beil, who most people know as the host of the popular podcast Dr. Death. And this is our first time on location. We're at her church, Lakewood United Methodist Church here in the Dallas area. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you.
And you haven't always been a podcaster, so to begin with, I want to start by just setting some context. Would you tell us a little bit about what life looked like before the world of podcasting and what led to it?
Yeah, so I didn't really get into podcasting. Podcasting came to me. So I was a long-time print reporter here in Dallas. I worked most of my career at the Dallas Morning News. I wrote about medicine, health issues. About, was it 10 years ago? Maybe it's longer than that. I quit to work at home. The newspaper industry is having some hard times. It was having hard times then. And so they were trying to downsize. So I volunteered to give up my job and work at home. My kids were little, so it was kind of nice to be able to work at home and be there for them when they got home from school. And so I started freelancing. And so since then, I've had mostly a print career. I write for magazines. The only newspaper I write for anymore is the New York Times. Mm-hmm. So I was just enjoying my, regular print life, and I got this out of the blue, a message from this podcast production company in LA called Wondery. And they had heard the story of Christopher Dent from a listener of a previous podcast that they produced called Dirty John. Mm-hmm. And a Dirty John listener reached out and said, hey, do you know the story of Christopher Dent? And they did not, because it got a lot of press here locally, but it didn't get a lot nationally, some, but not much. And so they started Googling, and then they found the story, and they were looking for somebody who could tell it for a podcast. And they asked if I would be interested. And I said, well, I'm a print reporter, right? I don't do audio. And I was a little leery at them because I hadn't listened to Dirty John. I hadn't heard of Wondery. I hadn't listened to a lot of podcasts at all before this. And so, there was some process of, me trying to figure out what I was getting into. And so I signed on to do a podcast. And they weren't, to their credit, they weren't so much worried about the audio. They were like, we just need somebody who can do the reporting, do the writing. We can show you how to do the audio parts of it. So they weren't concerned that I was a print writer. And they had worked with a print writer on Dirty John, and it had been fine. So,
now, were you familiar with the story of Christopher Dent prior to them approaching you?
Yeah, only what I had read in the paper.
Just locally?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I didn't know anything beyond what was already out there.
Right.
When I started.
Okay.
So at this point, we were talking earlier, my understanding was it was the most listened to podcast of 2018, or up there, 15 million something in 2018. And I think we were talking a few minutes before, you said you were up to like 30 million downloads.
As of about a month ago, so maybe in like mid-February, it was 30 million. I don't know what it is now.
So when you started this, did you have any notion that it was going to be received that it was going to be such a hit?
None.
None whatsoever.
30 million downloads.
I was just hoping.
crazy.
I was hoping that some people that I didn't actually know would listen to it. That it would be more than just, my friends and family and their friends who would listen to it. And it was funny, actually, before it came out, like everybody I knew, friends, relatives, I'm like, okay, can you just help me promote this? Can you just, like tweet it or put it on your Facebook page, email your friends? Because I'm trying to get, when it comes out, I just want to get the word out some. So there'll be like a decent number of people who will listen to it. So yeah, I was enlisting. I have a big family. I was enlisting
30 million large.
So I was enlisting like people I knew to,
Right.
I'm not on Instagram, but my daughter is. I'm like, okay, can you just put it on Instagram? Try to get the Instagram crowd to, listen to it. I was worried that I would do like 8 or 9 months of work that it took and nobody would listen.
So when did you know that it was a hit?
I started to suspect that it would be just more than my family listening, actually the morning that the first 2 episodes dropped, because I knew it was coming out. So I got up and I got the kids to school, and I wasn't going to look and see like on iTunes, how it was. And so I get up, I get the kids to school, I get back, and I'm like, okay, now I'm going to see. And I was hoping that it would rank like in the top 50, like somewhere in there, a decent showing. And I log into iTunes and I look at it's number 1, like from the first day.
Yeah, that's how I found it.
And so I thought, oh, wow, and then I thought, okay, it's some kind of glitch because, I've Googled it or something, and, maybe I didn't know how the algorithm worked. And I thought, well, that's just so weird. And so I refreshed on my phone and it was still number 1. Then I went to my computer and I erased all my history. And then I looked again because I thought, okay, so maybe it's not just on my computer that this is number 1. And that's the moment when I started to think, maybe people are going to listen to this story. And they did. So that was the point at which I thought, okay, well, maybe people will listen.
That's awesome.
So we've mentioned a little bit about the podcast itself, Dr. Death, and his name, Christopher Dent. Can you give us, for those who have not listened to the podcast, the 5 or 6 people in podcasting who haven't listened to it, can you just paint a little bit of picture of what the podcast is about?
Sure. So it focuses on the story of Christopher Dent, who was a neurosurgeon here in Dallas. And he operated for almost 2 years from the time he came from Memphis. And during that time, as you could probably tell by the title of the podcast, he was not a good surgeon. And the vast majority of his patients ended up paralyzed and 2 died. And that's kind of the story in a nutshell. However, it's not the real story.
Yeah.
Because I knew from the beginning that this was not really a story about Christopher Dent. It's a story about the healthcare system. And I think that's why it's resonated with so many people. It's not just bad surgeon. It's bad surgeon and how the system completely failed. I mean, he was passed from hospital to hospital. You know, like when he became, as I say in the podcast, when he became a problem at one hospital, they solved it by just making him somebody else's problem. And so that's really the running theme throughout, is how this happened. So it's not your typical true crime in that it's not a whodunit. I mean, you know from the beginning who did it. There's no surprises. Right. But it really looks at how it happened, you know, in this horrible case of pass the trash, you know, that happened, which happens in other institutions too, but it happened, you know, terribly this time.
So what do you feel like the importance was of telling that story?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I didn't want to do any story just for the, you know, salacious nature of it. Like, it had to have some deeper meaning to it. And one is that I felt like there were entities involved that had not been held accountable. He's certainly been held accountable, which if you listen to the podcast, you know, he himself has been held accountable for what happened. But there were people and institutions that were complicit in the events. And I didn't feel like they had been held accountable for what happened. And for this to not happen again, that had to occur. So that was part of it. And also to kind of give people a sense of, here's the healthcare system we depend on. And, you know, everybody who was hurt by this thought that they were doing their due diligence and looking up a surgeon. And so part of it, too, was to tell people, you know, we really are not able to find out a lot about our doctors, you know, that we think we are. And those patients who were hurt thought they were doing their homework. And that was quite disturbing, in that, you know, we can really only find out a lot about a doctor the same way you know, find out about a movie. You go online and you look for reviews, well, you know, or a restaurant, you know, and people should know that, get a second opinion, you know, empowering patients to do more so that this hopefully wouldn't happen again.
Well, and even the content they were able to find online was false, like this video promoting him as the best doctor. That was this totally fabricated promotional material, right?
And you couldn't tell because it looked like an award. I mean, it was an infomercial, but it looked like an award. Or his online reviews, which were, I mean, the guy had on Health Grades a 4.5 stars out of 5. You know, I mean, you can completely scrub your online presence if you want to.
Wow.
But that's what you look for. You know, you find a new doctor. What do? You start to Google.
Right.
And that's what all his patients did. And so I thought that part was important too in telling the story.
So you've mentioned that the story is not just about Dr. Death or Christopher Dent, but about the healthcare system. And your career has this great connection between science and medicine, and then this also inner conviction for justice and for telling a story and holding people accountable when there has been things that have been horrible to people's lives. So how have you found that has intersected in your life, and where has the passion and the drive come from in your life?
So I think that, and this is not just me, I think pretty much if you talk to any, you know, journalists, like we all go into it to try to make a difference. And so that's not unique to me or even to journalism. I mean, probably any, you know, you guys are pastors, you want to make a difference, right? And so we all, I think, are motivated by that, and we all do what we do. I think for me personally, part of it is, you know, I was raised by these Methodist social justice do-gooders.
Love that.
So, you know, from the beginning, like in my household, that was like my parents were always, you know, working to try to, you know, do things to help people who needed help in all sorts of ways. And I think that's probably part of where it comes from too. You know, we all are granted situations and talents to be able to make a difference. And so this is how I use mine.
So since the podcast has aired, obviously huge success, rave reviews, but have people contacted you personally to share the impact that story being told has had? Would you give us a few
I
examples
probably
of those?
get, even to this day, probably 4 to 5 emails a day.
Wow.
Which it doesn't sound like a lot, but then it
Sounds
adds
like a lot
up.
to me.
Yeah.
It adds up. I mean, you know, and especially
Oh, that's
I
incredible.
try to answer, but then, you know, I do have another job. And so, yes, for sure. And it runs the gamut A lot of it's from OR nurses. This has prompted a lot of discussion because nurses see the surgeons. They know who's really good and who's not. But because of the power imbalance, they have a hard time. And if you noticed in the podcast, there was one nurse that's in the first episode that kind of tried to speak up, but you can't. Or you can, but you risk losing your job or people saying, oh, you're just a nurse. So there's a lot of nurses, some medical students, residents, other doctors. I've heard a lot from patients who've I listened to your podcast. I'm going to have back surgery. I'm getting a second opinion.
Wow.
I'll tell you the most moving one of all the messages I've gotten was from a doctor he was either North or South Carolina. I can't remember the details, but he was an anesthesiologist. And he sent me this message, and he was so distraught that I actually called him to talk to him about it. So he had seen himself another terrible surgeon, a cardiac surgeon, and he said this person was responsible. He said, I know for 5 or 6 deaths that went unnoticed because they were just counted off as regular complications. And he said, and I didn't say anything. And he said, and I sat and I knew and I suspected and I didn't say anything. And now this person has gone on to another hospital. And I still carry this burden with me of not staying. And he said, after listening to the podcast and hearing the other doctors who were very courageous and very determined to stop him despite some pushback, I feel so ridden with guilt that I've had to retire. He couldn't keep going anymore because he was just so affected by hearing of another situation of another bad surgeon where there was a medical community that did try to stop him. And that was very moving to me. And that maybe there are doctors who I didn't hear from who might be more motivated to speak up because it's hard for doctors to speak out against their colleagues. I think that's true in any profession.
Sure.
It's probably hard for, teachers to speak out against other teachers or preachers to speak out against other preachers. I mean, it's probably there's a brotherhood or a sisterhood. And it's hard to go against that fraternity, I think.
Well, I will say, so my wife's a physician.
Yeah.
And she's the one who told me that I had to start listening to this podcast.
Uh-huh.
She's on a Facebook group of other female physicians. And she said, everybody's talking about this Dr. Dent. You have to listen to it. The story is just mind-blowing and fascinating. So I'm curious, did you know that you'd have such an impact on the medical community? Or did you think perhaps your audience was patients or...
I didn't know.
Okay.
I really didn't give it that much forethought. I think whenever you do a story as a journalist, you're always only thinking of the readers or the listeners in general, and that's who you serve. As to different demarcations within that, I didn't really give it much thought. I knew Baylor would be listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just think it's so incredible that just by telling a story and telling it well, that you're able to make actual, tangible differences in the future.
I hope so. And one hospital administrator sent me a message that his staff had listened to it and that they were doing a chart review within their hospital to see if they had any physicians who had outliers in terms of complications. It motivated them to determine who their bad doctors were.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's talk about telling a story well, because crafting a story is really not as easy as I think others on the outside may think. I mean, as you said, there's 9 months of research and reporting that went into this podcast. And so what were some of the key important things that you did in order to not only make the story compelling, because it's compelling on its own, but really craft the story well?
So it was a story that had a lot of moving parts, a lot of different elements, and bringing these together. I mean, that was a challenge. It's a challenge with any story, especially when, by the time all the scripts were done, all 6 scripts, there were about 40,000 words a copy, So it was a lot. But, the main things are where do you start and where do you end? And so I and the producers, this was a team. This wasn't just a solo effort.
Sure.
I mean, there's a team of people behind me. Made the decision to start in the middle, which if you listen to the podcast, you start the story in the middle. And there were a number of reasons for that. One is that I thought it was important from the beginning that you understand how bad a surgeon he was, that he wasn't just a little bit bad, that he was making errors that most surgeons never make. Mm-hmm. Because you have to start out from that point to really understand first just the outrage that he was allowed to continue. Mm-hmm. So that's why we started. The other reason to start with the Mary Eford surgery, which won't make any sense for people who haven't heard the podcast, but the reason to start is that became then later on central to events that occurred later. So like understanding what happened to her and understanding how bad a surgeon he was really a conscious decision. Now that said, that first episode was probably rewritten 10 or 12 times and re-recorded several times to get it right. We go back in the studio and listen, it's not right. There was stuff because you have to walk this line between the details that you include that show how bad a surgeon he was, but not overwhelming people or trying to exploit people's pain or trying to be not including details just to be gory. And it was still, I'm sure it was still hard to listen to. But you did have to understand how bad he was, that he was so bad that, you know, one of the doctors who came along behind him literally thought that he was an imposter because that no one who had been trained in surgery could be this bad. So that was the point to start with, but then you go back to the beginning, his backstory, and then eventually you catch up to the point where you started.
Yeah.
And that was a very conscious decision. And then where to end. Like, then there was well, are we just going to end with, and there are going to be so many spoilers in this, but like, how do you end? Like, oh, you know, he went to trial and he's in prison now. Do you end there? And I didn't want to end like right there for a number of reasons. But one is I thought that first then we have to ask a question, has anything changed that would keep this from happening again? And one of the most jaw-dropping moments in the podcast for me was when I posed that question to one of the doctors, Dr. Robert Henderson, who was involved. And so I'm ready for him to say, oh, this was so terrible. Everybody's learned their lesson. This is not going to happen again. And as you know from listening to the podcast, I ask him that question. There's this long pause, and he's like, no, you know. And that was, to me, we had to reflect on what had happened. And then the other thing that I felt strongly that we should do at the end of the story was to go back to the patients, because this was really about the people who were hurt. And I wanted to end with them and their voice and what they had to say. And there was this really incredible moment with one of the patients, Barry Morgulov, who just overwhelmed me with his capacity for forgiveness. And he wasn't the only one. Actually, he wasn't the only patient. And the fact that you could go through all of this and then forgive, I mean, that's just, I really wanted that moment to end quietly and to end on this act of forgiveness is, to me, a really powerful thing. And one of my favorite writers, Anne Lamott, I don't know if y'all read Anne Lamott.
Sure.
Oh,
She's
yes.
great. You love it. I love Anne Lamott. And, you know, her phrase, grace always bats last. So I thought grace bats last. And that's how the podcast ends is, you know, grace bats last.
Wow.
So
What a perfect ending and what a perfect theme to end a series like that on. You know, we find so often that these themes that we talk about in the church very regularly show up in sort of the secular world. And quite frankly, that's why time and time again, we're trying to communicate sort of the relevance even today of the gospel stories to people's lives. So we actually just finished a Lenten series called The Greatest Story. And the genesis of that series was our understanding of the fact that we have the greatest story in the existence of people to tell in the church. And we really wanted to remind ourselves of that and find some creative ways to tell it. I just was enthralled with you talking about sort of the intentionality behind some of the decisions that were made to craft the story in a more compelling way. What are some ways that you feel like the church maybe is doing a good job of telling the story of Christ, and maybe some ways that you think the church isn't quite getting it right?
So it's a little hard for me to answer just because I have been here at the same church for so long. So obviously there's something connecting here. I wouldn't keep driving all the way from Cedar Hill to come here long after I've moved from Lakewood. You know, I think when you tell a story, at least for me, I'm always thinking about the audience. And I think when you tell a story for someone else, that's when you lose touch. So I can't speak theologically, but I can speak in a journalism world. And if you have stories that are, you know, they're written for other journalists, or they're written to impress somebody else, or you can just tell when you read them that the intended audience is not the general people. And I think those are the stories that lose touch. So at least when I work, I try to think of who I'm talking to. So maybe if the church isn't doing it right, maybe they're not thinking of who they're talking to, and they're not making it attainable. I mean, that's the other thing. I write about science a lot. And you always think how to make it attainable. So I think if the church is failing, it's because they're not making it attainable and relevant. That's just a guess.
That's a pretty good guess.
I love that.
That's a good one.
I love that. I'm like thinking through my preaching and thinking, man, that's...
Are you preaching to the people?
Yeah, am I preaching to that one seminary professor who I know is sitting in the congregation? Or am I preaching to the majority of the congregation who needs to hear this in layman's terms?
Right.
And
Right.
I had a Greek professor in seminary. After we'd gone through 3 semesters of studying Greek and how to use it in your sermons, he said, the last thing I want you to know is to never use Greek in your sermons. We're like, what? He's like, yeah, use it in preparing for the sermon, but when you use it on a regular basis in your sermon, the congregation doesn't care. It might impress once here or there, but if you're using it on a regular basis, you have the wrong motivation.
Wow.
Well, the same thing in journalism,
I
I'd
love
say.
it.
Yeah.
So, Laura, now that you have this one under your belt, are you going to keep podcasting?
I'm working on another one right now.
Awesome. Can you tell us what it's called?
No. You can't. Stay tuned.
Any
So
hints?
close.
Is it about science?
Yes.
You heard it first here.
That gives it away. And medicine.
And medicine. Okay.
Wonderful.
We'll go with that.
Yeah.
We won't
so
press you further than that.
Yes. But when it comes out, I will. I'm not going to say you'll be the first to know.
No, yeah.
That'll be, Mom. But when it comes out, I will let you know.
We'll be near the top.
Yeah. Well, Laura, we have one more question that we ask everyone who comes on the podcast. And that question is this. At this point in your life, what's one thing that you wish somebody would have told you?
Just consider the present moment perfect because it's all you've got. So I'm kind of a worrier anyways, you might guess. And I say this to myself because I tend to obsess over, things. But it's like you just have to let go sometimes and enjoy the present moment. And it could be I'm feeling sentimental because my daughter's about to graduate from high school and I'm going to then I'm going to lose that. I'm like, where did that time go?
Yeah.
And I have no regrets. I quit my job to spend time with them, but it's like, so, that's what I would say, is just make each moment the best you can because you don't have anything else. The other thing I would say for journalists is don't go back and read your old stuff because it's all bad.
That's good.
Musicians can say this. I bet preachers could
I was
probably.
going to say sermons.
Yeah.
I don't want to go
That's
look at those.
You keep learning. I'm still learning. I've been in this business a long time and I'm still learning. But if I occasionally am doing something, and I'm very lucky, in the early days of my career is before the internet. So you can't go and log on the internet and find everything I ever did. Oh. Thank heaven. Because that's hard. Because then you look back and you're like, oh man, I thought that was good when I did it.
Well, the things that people can find are specifically this podcast, Dr. Death. Encourage everyone to go listen to it if you haven't, and we'll stay tuned for the work that you've got coming up next. So, Laura, thank you again so much for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fun.
We appreciate it.
One of the things I love about this podcast is when we interview guests, we get to hear about the intersection of faith and life. And it's particularly compelling when we hear about that intersection in someone like Laura Beil, as her passions of science and medicine combined with her passions of storytelling. And to think that she had no idea what she was getting into as she started this podcast, but now has had the opportunity to reach over 30 million people. I mean, that impact is just so inspiring. So the thought we want to leave you with today is a scripture that challenges us to think intentionally about the way we do everything in life, whether it's small or big.
So this scripture comes from Colossians chapter 3, verse 17. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. If you like the podcast, please feel free to share it, go online and leave a comment, or give us a rating so that others might hear about us. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure you also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to not miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at fumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Laura Beil for joining us this week, and make sure you tune in next Wednesday. Have a great week.